David Eby is a socialist. He's never believed in private property rights. He's getting exactly what he wanted, just as he did with the crime and addictions crisis, just as he has with the fiscal crisis in this province. And I just hope that sooner than later, British Columbians get a chance to say, that's enough of this kind of radical ideology pushing this agenda into the courts and undermining the economic basis of our prosperity.
Of course, there's always somebody who shows up to spoil any good party. In this case, it seems to be BC Premier David Eby. What do you make of Premier Eby's support for the tanker ban and Justin Trudeau's No More Pipeline legislation?
Well, you are pushing on one of my funny bones there, because I think this David Eby is a disaster for British Columbia and the Canadian Federation. I don't say that lightly. I'm actually not generally hyper partisan, and I worked very well with John Horgan, his predecessor, may he rest in peace. He became a good friend of mine. And John Horgan said to me that after BC lost at the Supreme Court in its effort to block the Trans Mountain Pipeline project, he said to me, look, Jason, we're downing tools. You guys have won. It's clearly the law of the land that the federal government regulates inter-provincial infrastructure like oil pipelines. He says, we're going to permit this. You can work with me, keep track of that commitment. But he said, you should be aware that there is in my party, he said, a mud hut wing. I'm not a member of it, he said, but there's a mud hut wing that is basically reflexively opposed to economic development, particularly resources. Now, he didn't say it explicitly, but in the context, later context of that conversation, it was pretty clear to me he was talking about his ultimate successor, David Eby, who is a hard left activist urban lawyer, originally from Ontario, who said that his original vocation, pre-politics, was, quotes, to sue governments. And that's what he did. In Indigenous law and environmental law at the BC Civil Liberties Association, which used to be a pretty mainstream organization, partly under Eby's leadership, it became a hard left organization. So this is a guy who has spent his entire pre-political life suing governments. He regards capitalism as evil. He is reflexively opposed to natural resource development, which has always been, the core, central to the Canadian and BC economies. And he has been radically wrong about things like criminal justice, drug decriminalization, de facto drug legalization, and the destigmatization of dangerous addictions. He now admits that. And he's also been, I think, radically wrong, as has the BC political and legal left-wing activists on a whole range of Indigenous issues. Now, I think almost all Canadians accept that we have a moral obligation and a political imperative to do reconciliation. But in Alberta, I used to call it reconciliation. It's not enough to do token land acknowledgements and all of that stuff. You actually have to work with Indigenous communities whose leadership want to lift their people out of poverty into prosperity and opportunity. And guess what? Most Indigenous communities live in remote areas whose virtually only potential economic economies are based on natural resources, forestry, mining, oil, gas, etc. In Alberta, we've seen the vast majority of First Nations embrace that very constructively. I helped to solve part of that because they didn't have access to capital, to buy equity, to buy an ownership stake in major projects. So I was the first in Canada to create a Crown corporation that allows for loan guarantees to facilitate access to commercial rates of credit for First Nations so they could buy into these big projects and have permanent, significant revenues coming in to benefit from the resources in their traditional territories. Now, that's not what David Eby is about. David Eby takes this, there's my good friend Ellis Ross, the MP for Skeena, former chief counselor of the Haisla First Nation, refers to the Eby attitude as, quotes, eco-colonialism. Basically, European background, left-wing urban lawyers and environmental activists who project onto Indigenous people their anti-development bias to appropriate the moral authority of Indigenous people in the context of this era of reconciliation. But as we saw with the Trans Mountain expansion, 111 of 119 affected First Nations had benefit agreements and supported it. All of the elected councils supported Coastal GasLink and LNG Canada. And I think the vast majority would support a Northwest Pipeline if they had ownership stake, proper environmental protections, and so forth. So my point is, Eby is trying to block that because he's just reflexively hostile. He's engaged in eco-colonialism, trying to appropriate the moral authority of the Indigenous people. He got crime wrong. He got the addictions crisis wrong. He's got BC driving off a fiscal cliff that future generations are going to have to pay for. And all of this in the context of the Trump threats. We're supposed to be about Team Canada, one Canadian economy. And you've got this one premier who is, you know what he's really doing? He is the single biggest barrier to national unity and prosperity in order to play to his hard left Vancouver NDP green left base. And I think it's a disgrace.
Yeah, he's not for the people, that's for sure. Staying with the plight of British Columbia under the so-called leadership of David Eby, what do you make of the recent court decisions that threaten private property in the province? Courts have now thrown the province's mineral staking system into disarray, and hundreds of acres of privately owned properties in Richmond, BC may not actually belong to the people who paid for them.
Yeah, as I was saying, I think, Eby has helped to contribute to this legal environment. He and his fellow travelers, his political and legal allies, his activist left-wing lawyers have been going to Indigenous communities now for the past couple of decades, saying that there's uncertainty around Indigenous title in British Columbia, the lack of treaties, we all know that. And so let's sue and sue and sue and be ever more aggressive to the point where you've got a court saying, okay, I think a pretty tenuous Indigenous claim from a Vancouver Island, let's be clear, the Cowichan are a Vancouver Island First Nation, and the court said they had some evidence of some Cowichan coming over in the 1850s to pick berries and fish. And so that subordinates the private property rights of people who, in good faith, have assumed that they own that land. If you apply this more broadly to all of the claims in British Columbia, it will be economic chaos. And where do the vast majority of people have their life savings? Locked up in the value of their homes, of their private property. Good, honest, hard-working, law-abiding people, and in the case of Richmond, most of them new Canadians, most of them immigrants, who we invited here with the implicit promise that they could work hard, put their savings into their home equity, and enjoy a bit of retirement, pass something on to their kids. And now we're saying, oh, all that was a con because some people were picking berries here in the 1850s. Look, I agree. We need to be serious about reconciliation. And BC has some really complex legal issues to untie with the absence of treaties. But what people like Eby have done is again, create this legal environment which is completely severed from any reason. Like, if you look at successful models of Indigenous reconciliation, for example, the New Zealand model with the Maori, it's a little simpler because there's one nation as opposed to dozens here, but they have found a path in reconciliation that respects private property rights and respects the need for economic growth. But Eby made it even worse because as Attorney General, he brought forward the legislation to give legal effect in British Columbia to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I said to John Horgan when he was doing this, John, are you sure that this makes sense? Free, prior, and informed consent on everything, everywhere, all the time? He said, well, I'm told by my lawyers his lawyers, David Eby, it's going to create greater certainty. Well, look what it's done. Quite predictably created total uncertainty with the recent court decision saying, hey, UBC, legislature made this law. You don't have consent on this mining project. So the implications, and this is, a lot of the critics or people who have questioned these policies for the past 25 years, going back to my late friend, Mel Smith, he was the Deputy Attorney General under Bill Bennett. He was the first to voice serious concerns about this stuff. But so many people have been attacked if they asked questions about UNDRIP, asked questions about the jurisprudential direction of some of these decisions. They've been called racists and pushed and marginalized and ridiculed. And now the chickens are coming home to roost. So I just hope that, to quote my predecessor, Ralph Klein, I hope that severely normal British Columbians, hardworking, law-abiding, tax-paying people, say, hold on a second here. Yes, we respect Indigenous people. Yes, we understand reconciliation is important. Yes, we're not opposed to rational and reasonable treaty settlements and negotiations. But we have to do this in the context of a big, complex, modern economy rooted in private property rights. David Eby is a socialist. He's never believed in private property rights. He's getting exactly what he wanted, just as he did with the crime and addictions crisis, just as he has with the fiscal crisis in this province. And I just hope that sooner than later, British Columbians get a chance to say, that's enough of this kind of radical ideology pushing this agenda into the courts and undermining the economic basis of our prosperity.